Betsy Prioleau is an author, a radio personality, a teacher, so many things, and I'm trying to find the page. Tells me all the things. But anyway, most of you probably know. She received a PhD in American literature from Duke University, went to teach English and world literature at Manhattan College. She was a scholar in residence at NYU, and most recently taught cultural history in the NYU Liberal Studies program. She is the author of Swoon, Great Seducers, and Why Women Love Them, and Seductress, Women Who Ravish the World and the Lost Art of Love. And now, let us welcome Betsy Prioleau.
Thank you, Jeanette, for that fabulous, over-the-top introduction. I have been a member of the Society Library since 1986 and practically lived in the stacks upstairs. So I feel like I'm in my second home here. It's such a privilege and an honor to be here, and thank all of you for turning out on this raw spring night. So first of all, how many of you have heard of Mrs. Frank Leslie? My guess is hardly anyone. Here we are at the end of Women's History Month, and she's nowhere to be seen. She's on none of the roll calls of famous American women, not even my own grandfather's book. So why? I think when you hear her story, you'll have some idea. Her life isn't for the grade school classroom. But in the Gilded Age, she was a national celebrity. She was one of the most famous women of the day, a phenomenon. When women were angels in the house, confined to the private sphere, denied equality and financial independence, Mrs. Frank Leslie ran the largest publishing company in America on cutthroat male turf for 20 years. She steered Frank Leslie Publishing Company, and this is just a sample of some of the publications, to nationwide supremacy and made a fortune. She was a brilliant businesswoman. She was also an author of 6 books and a play, just another sample here, a lecturer, a translator. This is her travels to Central America, a prominent social figure, and a fashion icon. She was not a natural beauty. She had a Roman nose, bulb eyes, and a thin, wide-drawn mouth. But she gave the impression of beauty. Her figure was the Gilded Age hourglass ideal, a prodigious bust, a plump derriere, and, quote, a waist that could be spanned by a necklace. As one of her admirers said, she was, quote, more than a full bushel. All this was enhanced by her expressive features and what she called the little deceptions of the toilet table. She would make special use of these items in the lower right, theatrical makeup and skin whitener. She had professional's expertise, as we will see. She also epitomized the Victorian ideal lady with her well-bred manner and noble carriage. She might have walked out of Blenheim Palace. As she said, it came naturally. She was a born aristocrat, raised between a plantation and a New Orleans mansion, and nursed by a dear old mammy. Her proper Bostonian mother trained her in social graces, and her cultivated, rich cotton broker father schooled her in the tenets, this quote, tenets of old aristocracy. What's wrong with this picture? Everything. It's a total fabrication. Like many of the Gilded Age self-invented characters, she made herself up. Beneath the persona of the patrician great lady, she concealed a tangled skein of secrets. She was beneath all of these layers of her curated image, which was carefully cultivated, she had a past that resembles a R-rated melodrama. She actually grew up in a disheveled, hard-knock background. She was born in 1836, likely the daughter of one of her father's enslaved women. There's a list of possible candidates over there. Actually, the mammy might have been, it's really weird, her own mother. She grew up in poverty on the wrong end of Dauphine Street in a house that probably looked something like this. Her absentee father, who had long lost his slaves, was a bounder and a bankrupt, and his common law wife, Susan, quote, kept a parlor house for men, no questions asked. Until she was 14, Miriam and her adopted mother, Susan, lived a pillar-to-post existence until they wound up in New York City. Miriam drew a veil around these next 7 years, but here's the true story. In 1852, her only means of support dried up. This charitable uncle fell ill. And she, at 16 years old, was cast on her own resources. The opportunities for women were few. 75 cents a week for brutal piecework, or as much as $5 a night for sex work. Miriam took the nom de rue Minnie and entered the trade, attending public balls. There were many of these every night for the purpose, where she was, quote, well up in the market. But it was better to be married in the business, which was the start of Miriam's marital adventures. At 17, she found a jewelry clerk, David Peacock, who loaned her diamonds. Now, this was Miriam's lifelong passionate fetish in exchange for favors. She then charged him with seduction, punishable by 5 years in New York's worst prison. This is the Tombs up there. And press-ganged him into marriage and a quick annulment. But times were tough. There was anarchy in the city and a crackdown on prostitution. Then, in the nick of time, Lola Montez, the notorious courtesan and world-conquering Siren, entered the scene. Turns out, Miriam's half-brother had just committed suicide over Lola, and to atone, Lola adopted Miriam as her sister. She trained her for the stage and took her on an East Coast theatrical tour. This is an image of them crossing the Hudson River. Anyway, she included lessons in seduction, from the basics of cosmetic artistry to the bravura moves of fascination. That book is still a handy guide, by the way. Miriam would put these lessons to use all of her life. Trouble is, she put them to use too soon. Lola caught her entwined on tour with a Tennessee Congressman, William Churchwell, and summarily fired her and disinherited her. Lola had quite a fortune at that point. But all wasn't lost. Churchwell set her up as his mistress, a decided promotion, and bought her a 7th Street townhouse. 7th Street was a short walk to Castle Garden. This was a popular trysting ground. And there she met E.G. Square, the prominent anthropologist. This is his famous book on Peru. 2 years later, they were married, and Miriam achieved the imprimatur of respectability. But old habits die hard. The print baron, Frank Leslie of the Leslie Publishing Empire, soon appeared. A buff, rich, quote, fireballer. He founded illustrated journalism in America and revolutionized the industry with divisible blocks, which could produce an engraving in a day instead of a week, and with his graphic sensationalistic stories like this famous swill milk expose that attracted the widest popular audience. Now, when he had hired E.G. for the newspaper during the Civil War, he left his wife and moved in with the Squares. For 10 years, the threesome lived in a heated ménage à trois, with the lovers sharing adjacent bedrooms and stolen weekends. Now, disposal of Square was a challenge. Eventually, Frank paid off his wife, but Miriam had to devise stronger measures. She had to procure definite proof of adultery, and divorced women were social pariahs. But the CIA couldn't have done it better. Miriam hired 2 Leslie illustrators to invite E.G. to a grand dinner at a 24th Street Temple of Venus, disguised as an elegant brownstone. The lady boarders, as they were called, Gypsy and Indiana, arrived in décolleté gowns, and after champagne, risque songs, and an elaborate banquet, they led the inebriated E.G. Square upstairs. 30 minutes later, the illustrators arrived and sketched E.G. nude on this chair with the naked women at his feet. That was all Miriam needed. She threatened to publish the pictures in Leslie's Day's Doings. This was a naughty tabloid. And E.G. agreed the next day. He was actually forbidden by New York law to ever marry again. A prestigious marriage to Frank Leslie, now the Grand Seigneur of Publishers Row, should have ended Miriam's misadventures. Now she was rich and respectable beyond her dreams. They burned through money and lived like maharajas. There was a mansion on Fifth Avenue and a 100-acre Saratoga estate, Interlaken, where they ferried guests around the lake on the Frank Leslie steam yacht and gave elaborate banquets and entertainments. But only a year later, Miriam was in the thick of an affair with a swashbuckling poet, Joachim Miller, the Byron of the Rockies. That lasted, you can't make this up, that lasted on and off, you can believe, 30 years. He hemmed her in love poems, this is his collection, and featured her in his novel, The One Fair Woman, as the most matchless and magnificent woman in the world. In 1860, she got an even bigger boost in the world. Frank Leslie had died and left the company bankrupt. After she rescued the empire with her Garfield assassination scoop, you can see the newspaper there, she won national fame. She was now the queen of Park Place, a, quote, miracle moneymaker, a media mogul. Now, she had nothing left to wish for. She had fame, rank, money, and dominion in the marketplace. She upgraded to New York's most luxurious apartment building, the Garlotte, and held court. She opened a chic Thursday salon for the literati and cultural elite and mingled with the marquee names of the day. She paraded the latest French couturier fashions. I think that's one of her gowns, actually, and became the fashion czar, the style setter of the age, kind of another Anna Wintour, something like that. Anyway, all the while, beneath this elegant, genteel persona, her love life barreled along. There were 2 fiancés, the Marquis de Louville, a poet adventurer who also wrote her love poems, and a Russian prince, Prince George Aristophe de Goury. These two came to blows over her in Hyde Park. That's another story. And there were rumors of others. This is Albert Pulitzer, Joseph's brother, a successful journalist in his own right, and a romantic novelist, and a Louisiana pretty boy she installed in the garage. Her fortunes continued to rise. She finessed the problem of female leadership in business and forestalled the hostility to women in business, which was massive. In an executive tour de force, she assumed the guise of the porcelain Southern Belle. She wore tight black satin dresses with organdy aprons and greeted men in a musical contralto with a raven quill in her hand. Men didn't suspect the hard-knuckled commander at the controls who wielded a typewriter. She ran this company like a field marshal. 9 department heads reported to her each day, and she vetted every aspect of the business. She vetted editorials, story submissions, she proofed manuscripts, she approved layout, she signed all the money orders and contracts, and she oversaw 400 employees and as many as 12 magazines and newspapers. Then, at the height of her fortunes, the roof caved in. She neglected a journalistic revolution, the onslaught of the sensationalistic, cheap dailies created by Pulitzer and Hearst that had eaten into her weekly. In desperation, she sold part ownership of the illustrated newspaper to Arkell and Judge Publishing. Then her romantic life went to pieces. In a weak moment, she married for the 4th time Oscar Wilde's older brother, Willie Wilde, who was 16 years her junior. He was a dissolute, layabout, sponge, and a drunk. After the wedding supper at Delmonico's, she discovered that he couldn't deliver in bed. After that, he left his false teeth on the bureau, hurled bottles and insults, and once threatened to throw her down an embankment and break her neck. After 18 months, she discarded him. She was an expert at adultery stings. But the press sided with Willie. She was an ugly, wrinkled, 60-year-old shrew who tied him to her apron strings and browbeat him. Her failures continued to mount. Her lecture tour flopped. Her play, The Froth of Society, based on a Dumas farce, bombed. And her new book, Are Men Gay Deceivers, sank without a bubble. Her expected accolades at the Chicago World's Fair, where women were to be honored, came to naught. She was off message and fit nowhere under the feminist tent. She proposed a cuttlefish velvet hammer approach to female power. The early feminists did not agree. And you can see these dreadful caricatures of the 3 groups at the fair. The militant feminists, as you know, demanded direct political action. The lady managers championed charity work. And the WCTU, the worst caricature, rallied the purer sex to clean up indecency, especially male indecency. At this point, Miriam's spirits sank to an all-time low. She felt that she was on a dark stretch on fate's iron road. Her social aspirations were also foiled. She wanted acceptance. She wanted the armor of class and status. But, it was a ridiculous reach. I mean, she was a triple divorcee, a woman in the professions from Lord knows where. And high society, of course, froze her out, the likes of Mrs. Vanderbilt and Mrs. Astor. They cut her in the street, and she was left off of all the social registers and elite guest list. Then, in 1895, her prize publication, the Popular Monthly, foundered. 1895 was the year of the magazine, and Miriam had been distracted and asleep at the wheel. Frank Munsey, a newcomer on the block, shook up the whole industry with his Munsey's magazine. He dropped the price to 10 cents and pitched his 36-page magazine to the hustling masses who wanted cheap reads at their level on, as you can see, hot topics. The circulation soared, and the other magazines followed suit. Everybody but Miriam. She kept the Popular Monthly at the same 25 cents, the same 128 double column pages of neo-romantic content designed for the polite bourgeois parlor. She lost her publishing edge and leased the Popular Monthly to an ad man, Frank Culver, for 5 years. To make matters worse, she took an ill-advised European vacation from 1895 to 1898. And while she was there acquiring continental eclat and trying to breach high society, she lost touch with the zeitgeist at home. The American love affair with high society was cooling, and the progressive movement and a collective social conscience was gathering steam. The press laced into her pretensions, and her fan base was eroding. And when things couldn't get worse, she lost her entire fortune. The weekly went under, and her investment with it, and the Popular Monthly was in a death spiral. Now, this is where Miriam Leslie's grit, fight, and brilliance come in. At 62, now the average life expectancy for women was 64. She took the helm, caught the popular wave, and rescued the Popular Monthly. She hired top writers, Bret Harte up there, William Dean Howells, Henry James, and targeted the urban middle-class reader, and publishing no more than 12 snappy articles per issue. Circulation in 4 months rose to 200,000, and she achieved her second publishing coup and recouped her fortune. But it was too soon to break out the champagne. Months later, the majority shareholder, this Culver guy, fired her and erased the Frank Leslie name from publishing history. As the New York Times said, she was now an anachronism on Publishers Row. You would think at this point she was down for the count, but not Mrs. Leslie. In 1900, she rose from the ashes and recreated herself a Baroness de Bezous, based on a bogus descent from an 18th century Huguenot noble. She stamped B and her crest on 17 trunks and socialized in the highest European circles. There she met the Spanish Marquis. This is an early photograph. Spanish Marquis Teodoro Martel y Fernandez Cordova, who was gentleman-in-waiting to King Alfonso. He was almost her fifth husband and died just before the wedding. She wore his gold keys to the king's bedchamber like a rosary around her waist until she died. Then she orchestrated an exit for the books. First of all, she wrote her own obit. As you can see up there, she subtracted 13 years from her age. As she lay dying, though, she was surrounded by this vulpine circle of helping hands and relatives eager to get their hands on her money. Then, in a flash finale, this was Lola's phrase, she dropped a bombshell. She left the bulk of her $2 million fortune to Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Suffrage Association, for women's suffrage, no strings attached. The legacy, the largest ever given, salvaged the 19th Amendment just when the movement was fractured and circling the drain. So back to Women's History Month. Why has she been left off of all these halls of fame? I think it's anybody's guess. It could be the puritanical streak in feminism. I mean, she was too sexy, too glamorous, or it could be that she was off script. Her Machiavellian approach to female power is still controversial. Or maybe they just didn't like her. I mean, she is not the most lovable female exemplar. She was egocentric, vain, bigoted, snobbish, hard-boiled, and high-handed. And heaven knows, I mean, her passions were really unworthy of her. All those titles, ovations, and diamonds, and ostentatious displays. Plus, her persona was a tissue of lies. But, you know, she was really leagues ahead of her time, a titanic vanguard figure of huge charisma, strength of character, and chutzpah, who tore up the feminine script, faked out the patriarchy, and sidewinded to unimaginable power and influence. She gave a lot of thought to women of the future, and she thought she had some tips to pass on. Executive savvy, giant selfhood, that was big for her, courage, image management, and sort of a bulletproof MO to subvert opposition, break the glass ceiling, and call the shots. She loved to say that the woman of the future is the power of the future. But, you know, she'd like it a lot better to be recognized as one of the pioneer female power players and feminists of history. A publicity diva, she would hate to be forgotten. So in case I forget, I'm sure you have some questions about this extraordinary woman. Kathy. Hi, Kathy. Good to see you. Well, she makes a cameo appearance. Sorry, I've got this allergy here. Yeah, she makes a cameo appearance in Seductress. And she was somebody who could coordinate her love life and her professional life, it seemed to me then. But again, I then only had one biography to work from. And I realized that that biography had bought into all of Miriam's myths about herself. So when Women's History Month rolled around, the centennial is what I'm really thinking about, because that's when I started this. I then thought, why has she been left off? What's going on here? And that began the dig into who she really was. She's not represented in the round at all in Seductress. Yeah.
Is there any thought to why she has no children?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. It's interesting because my theory is based on some little medical help I got that E.G. had syphilis. And if that's the case, it explains what happened 2 years after they were married. He took her to Europe, and I found a letter from E.G. to his father that said, Miriam is sick for cause, and unless something happens, you will be a grandfather soon. So I'm assuming she got pregnant and had a spontaneous abortion. That would have been more typical if he had syphilis and had given it to her. And it raises another question. She had a lifelong horror of children. I mean, she really, really hated them. And I think it had to do with pain, you know? I think it was the pain of that experience, and she couldn't bear to face it. So that's just my grade Z on that one. Yeah.
Didn't you do your dissertation on William Dean Howells?
I did.
Well, I wondered if, since she hired him, whether from the point of view of him, ever you came across her at all at that time?
Yeah, well, the funny part is they were engaged in a war earlier in her career. It was something called the Realism War. And at that time, there was the kind of literature that Miriam was producing in her magazines, which was neo-romantic. It was something that Howells detested.
Yeah.
And then he was producing realistic literature and arguing for truth to observed reality. Miriam wanted escapist literature. So they were daggers drawn. There was an awful lot of back and forth there. Then later on, she wised up when she had to rescue her magazine. She saw where the wind was blowing. He was the dean of American letters. You know, he was so popular. And so she recruited him.
A question from the live stream. That sounds good. So obviously she went through a lot of men, and I also note that she wrote a book called Are Men Gay Deceivers? Can you talk a little bit more about how she viewed men as a unit, or is
Yeah, well, this is the sort of, you know, here she is a progressive. I portrayed her as being leagues ahead of her time. But there's a very interesting sort of regressive strain in her too, where she bought into some of the feminine ideals of the time. One of them was the idea that women needed a chivalric male provider, and she yearned for this all of her life. I think it had to do with all of the bankrupt men in her family. I mean, she had to be the man in the family, and I think she yearned for protection. But she did subscribe to some of those very feminine concepts. And I think that's why she was continually in pursuit of men. Apart from the fact, I mean, you have to admit, she may have been very highly sexed. That people always leave that out of the equation. They just figure, well, you know, she needed men, she wanted admiration, and so on. But I don't think that's true, because she wouldn't have been so upset about Willie, you know, if it had just been, you know, that.
Oh, Betsy,
Yeah.
what do you think her real appeal was? I mean, we look at her and she's not a beautiful woman. We know she's trained with Lola Montez.
Mhm.
Do you think it was just her huge sex appeal?
Oh no, she gave a tremendous amount of thought to this, and she wrote a lot about it. She wrote a wonderful essay called The Fascinating Woman, and she broke it all down.
Wow.
And she thought that the arts of conversation were primary. She thought vitality, she thought beautiful dress. I guess that's retro, but she really believed that dress could be extremely erotic. And then she believed that men were attracted to women with strong identities. That, again, was not popular at the time, but she believed that somebody with sparkle who could speak 4 languages and who had some panache, not to mention charisma, was very attractive to men. And she never had any trouble attracting men, which is to her credit, considering she wasn't a beauty, and that's pretty obvious.
Did she have a long-term relationship with the suffragists, or was her bequest a spur-of-the-moment deathbed thing?
No, if she had a secret underground relationship with the suffragists. Jane Wilde, I think, was the person who spurred her first. And after she met Jane Wilde, this was Oscar's mother, who was very ardent feminist, very much an ardent feminist. After she met Jane, she started giving money. This was maybe 15 years before she died, to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So she was constantly feeding them money. And then if you read her essays carefully, she had a lot of feminist, maybe proto-feminist opinions that were shocking at the time. I mean, she thought that women were the superior sex, and that they would one day be doctors, lawyers. And she didn't discount the fact that they would be presidents. Mm-hmm.
It happens a lot, it has happened for a lot of time in the scientific community, in fact, in history, where assistants and people who are not necessarily promoting themselves so much were behind a lot of the successes. And if you flip it around and you look at Mir's experience, I'm wondering, were other people trying to take the credit when she was in charge for the success of the magazine, or was she very open about the fact that she was doing everything and it was all because of her? Were there other people trying to take credit for it, or maybe saying she's just continuing what?
Oh, no, she wouldn't have stood for that. Absolutely not. No. She called herself she was the empress of journalism. No, she ran the show, and she constantly, she didn't have a low opinion of herself. She compared herself, well, maybe it was compensatory, I don't know, but she identified with Napoleon. And she she would never have let a man steal her thunder. I mean, no, indeed. No, the point was her gig was that, yes, I did this as a woman, as the most womanly woman, the ideal Victorian woman. How about that? So she never came, her motto was never come down from your pedestal. She exploited that Victorian idea and used it to her purpose. It's kind of female judo.
Did she respond in that same strong way to the kind of slights that she must have had along the way, including not being accepted in this disastrous 400? I mean, does she write about how that affected her?
Oh, she did. She was furious about it. And then there were constant little pinprick attacks in her writing against the 400. One of them that she thought that McAllister was boorish and he didn't know anything about real European aristocracy and how people actually behaved. So she drew herself up and carried on, as though it didn't matter to her at all. It was defensive, of course, but that was her approach.
But she apparently had excellent taste in authors in terms of contributors to her journal.
At the end, but not in the beginning.
Not in the
I've read through all of the early popular monthlies, and you don't want to go there. It's pink Valentine prose, as Stephen Crane called it. It's treacly. It's something that you can't read today. It's really purple prose about, aristocracy, and it's sensationalistic and melodramatic and people tumbling down cliffs and surviving it and so forth. It is, in the end, she came around. And I think she was acquainted with great literature. It's just that she knew what the public wanted and provided that. Hi, Claudia.
How did you manage to spare it out the detail of her early life?
Yeah, that's interesting because it had never been discovered before. And here I just say a prayer to the accessible archives and also the records from the Supreme Court that you can now get, because the early biographers didn't have access to this stuff. So I could go back to the court records, and that's where most of the material came from. There were testimonials and dockets. I could find out that, that her father was a bankrupt. In fact, one of the slides I showed, I didn't point it out, but it showed that he was chronically insolvent. But nobody had really ferreted out that before. And that's true with most of the information that I got from the court dockets and from accessible archives, where I could go right into the Frank Leslie illustrated newspaper, and I could get her real opinions on topics and that sort of thing. So it's really due to modern technology, in a way, that this was all possible. Mm-hmm.
What was the number that you said that she gave to the
suffragists at the end.
Oh, she gave $2 million.
Yeah, so.
I think it's, how does that translate today? Maybe 52 million? I don't know, but
What I don't understand is, was she, in all these, when she kept losing money or losing and raising, did she ever store money or save money?
she was an extremely good businesswoman.
So when she went
She
off
looked
to
after
Europe,
her
she had
business.
money to spend.
Yeah, no, she had a really good financial manager named Kramer. And when she recouped her second fortune, he took the money and quadrupled it. So she died of a rich woman. She also had investments all over the place in New York real estate, which I discovered. She even had a hotel in Georgia. I mean, there were kind of things like that. So she took care of herself. This was after she recouped her fortune. When she lost everything, she really lost everything. But then she recouped it when she was 62. What's really interesting, this is a digression, I know, but you watch the Gilded Age and you see the Vanderbilts and all that, and you see Alva Vanderbilt could have given. She was rich, and yes, she was a suffrage person, and she's all the halls of fame. But she could have rescued this. Think of it; it would have been chump change for her to rescue the whole movement. But instead, she gave little parties at Newport, and people had to pay admission, that sort of thing.
Thank you so much, Betsy.